Good morning and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Poa on Bermudagrass Greens, presented by PBI Gordon and taught by J. McCurdy, Ph.D. My name is Lisa Wick. I'm the Senior Manager of E-Learning Programs here at GCSAA and will serve as today's moderator. We are recording today's event and you'll get access to that recording. Your audio is muted in this system, but we encourage you to ask questions. You can do that by clicking the raise hand icon and we can unmute you. You can ask the question directly, or you can type in the question answer box in the GoToWebinar control panel. If your control panel has minimized, you'll see a narrow strip with an orange rectangle at the top. Click on that and that will open up the control panel where you'll be able to type into the question answer box. You'll also be able to access the handout of today's presentation that Jay has provided. Today's session is eligible for 0.1 GCSA education points, and at the end of the webinar, we'll give you that code to use on the association's website. We hope that you'll find today's webinar valuable. It's brought to us in partnership with PBI Gordon. With a full line of herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, growth regulators, and other products, PBI Gordon Corporation is a national leader in the professional turf and ornamental management industry. Today's presenter is J. McCurdy, Ph.D., who is an assistant professor and extension specialist at Mississippi State University. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Tennessee Martin, a master's from the University of Tennessee Knoxville, and a doctorate in agronomy and soils from Auburn University. McCurdy's research interests include turfgrass weed ecology and management, herbicide resistance, pesticide fate, and wildlife habitat inclusion within urban environments. Please join me in welcoming today's presenter, Jay McCurdy, PhD. Jay?
Thank you, Lisa. This should be fun. This is an interesting topic, albeit I think one that is very difficult. It's a challenge to manage golf course putting greens, and then it's really a challenge when you have issues with annual bluegrass. So a lot of what we talk about today is going to revolve around some of the real difficulties of annual bluegrass in general. And then later on, towards the end of the presentation, we'll try to dig a little deeper into some program approaches and things like that that hopefully enhance our ability to control this difficult to control weed. So let me first and foremost say that I am not alone in the pursuit of POA control within golf course putting greens. Most recently, I think last year, I had a presentation with Dr. Sean Askew, who's at Virginia Tech. I worked under the direction of Scott McElroy at Auburn University, and so I owe a lot to a lot of folks, and I try to give credit where credit is due. Right now, I'm actually part of a 16-university study that encompasses a number of different folks. You can see most of them here credited in this POA project slide. So I owe a lot to them as far as developing some of the methods we're using to test some research that we're conducting, as well as just in tossing around ideas. I don't think I'm alone when I say that this is a really challenging problem and one that we're not going to solve just chemically. And so a lot of the research we're doing with this group revolves around non-chemical control as well as cultural control. So a brief kind of agenda for the next, I don't know, 90 minutes, Lisa, is that what we need, 90 minutes?
Yes, sir. Okay,
so we're going to fill the time with a lot of information. I hope that you enjoy it. We're going to talk about herbicides available for greens briefly. Herbicide resistance management. This is probably the leading cause of frustration for me when I get phone calls like I fielded yesterday, and I do pretty much every day this time of year. They often go something like this. Hey, I've got a golf course putting green. It's got annual bluegrass on it, and my 2, 3, 4, 5 applications of this didn't control it. And we start trying to back up, talking about timings, talking about what was in the tank. But in the end, what the conversation usually comes down to is you've got a probably, although not confirmed, a case of herbicide resistance. So cultural practices become a huge part of managing those populations. Program approaches that not only manage the weed on the plain surface, the putting green itself, but also managing the POA on the rest of the golf course. Because ultimately, where's the seed coming from that is establishing that POA population on your golf course putting green. You know, it should be no secret that seed is coming from elsewhere on your golf course, most likely, unless you've got some trafficked in, which is possible, but in most instances, POA is coming in off your own golf course. So controlling POA on the rest of the golf course is increasingly important with cases of resistance. No one wants to treat greens with herbicides. I think that we all know there's a potential for decreased turf density. There is certainly the potential to cause more susceptibility to disease, to shade intolerance, to nematodes. We all know that herbicides don't just control, even selective herbicides, don't just control the intended weed. They often affect the crop. And especially on putting greens where we have low mowing heights, we have increased traffic, and we have in many instances very shallow root systems, we have a real hard time controlling those weeds without causing problems, detriment to our crop. An integrated approach is required. This is going to mean cultural practices as well as both pre and post herbicides. Not necessarily pre-emergence herbicides on putting greens, although we talk about some of those options. I'm not very fond of them, but certainly pre-emergence herbicides in and around the collar region, as well as around the rest of the plain surface around the golf course. So this is a result of an incorrect or over application of an Anderson's goose and crab product. This is Bermudagrass Green, located in southern Mississippi. I've looked at a dozen or so that are like this. Very often what this is manifesting itself as is thinned areas of turf that is not recuperating from stresses. So in this instance, this golf course has shade on the south side of this green and the north side, which is to my back, I believe, or to my left here. And what we're seeing is that periodically throughout the year, we have weakened turf areas that are not able to overcome an incorrect or even a labeled application of Anderson's goose and crab. I wish I could see a show of hands as to who's using Anderson's goose and crab on golf course putting greens, and probably 90% of you. Yes.
You can do that if you want to.
Can we really?
Yes.
Okay.
There's a little button. You and I don't have it. It's on that little narrow strip that I mentioned that has the orange rectangle at the top. So if everybody who is using, what do you call it, goose and crab?
Yeah, Anderson's goose and crab.
If you'll click that raise hand button for us right now, we can see how many people are actually using that.
And if you're not a golf course superintendent, abstain, and you know, we'll try to parse out some of the reasons why you should know about Anderson's goose and crab in a few minutes. So I'm going to keep talking. Raise your hands and let me know. So if you've used this product, most of the time you will have seen some kind of injury. It might be a delay in green up. It might be susceptibility to disease. It might even be that you just highlight some of your problem areas where you have increased traffic on walk-ups or on and around normal pin placements. Those are typically where we see problems.
Okay, and
so I start the conversation. Yes.
25 people raise their hand.
Okay, so you know I've looked through here. I don't know how many of your golf course superintendents, but enough of you that you've probably seen some of the issues I'm talking about. And so intuitively, we know herbicides are going to cause problems. So do companies, and the companies are the ones that are trying to make money selling you products. They're also trying to limit their liability, and limiting liability is important for a company. Otherwise, many of these products just wouldn't get labeled and wouldn't come to market. So what often happens is we've got a gap where we just don't have herbicides that we can apply to these scenarios. The herbicides that we do have in many instances are labeled only by omission. So I've got this slide that Sean Askew and I presented several years ago. I checked and made sure that this was up to date yesterday, but don't just take this to your club and say we're going to apply all these herbicides to our golf course putting green. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm trying to highlight is just how limited of an arsenal of products there actually are for this scenario. So we've got Anderson's goose and crab, or crab and goose, a dithiopyr product that Anderson's at one time marketed, and I'm not even sure if you can buy it anymore. Lesco may have an equivalent or analogous product, and there's other products that are formulated. I'll talk in a little bit more, a little bit further down about this, but I want to drive home there are no Dow, DuPont, Corteva licensed or labeled dithiopyr products. So I am not by any means endorsing using any of these products on a golf course putting green. But dithiopyr used to be one that was labeled on Bermudagrass putting greens. So that just goes to say that there are some options, and maybe sometimes it takes a little while for labels to catch up. Revolver, metsulfuron, transit ribsulfuron, those are labeled. By omission, we've got a number that most of us already know about. So that's one that I didn't know about was pendulum. This is oversight. When I talk to the BASF people, they say that this by omission should be changed in the next few years in the labeling process to reflect their current stance, which is don't use pendulum on golf course putting greens. Pendulum is a mitotic inhibiting herbicide, one of those yellow herbicides like barricade and dithiopyr that ultimately lead to, in some instances, when used at higher rates or incorrectly, root decline. And so pendulum on your putting green would not be good. Pendulum on the rest of the golf course is usually fine. Curb, this is another mitotic inhibiting herbicide, although with a slightly different binding site, slightly different uptake and translocation mechanism. We'll talk more at length about curb, monument, exonerate, maybe even a little bit about negate here in a little while. Broadleaf herbicides, we have, periodically broadleaves on our research putting greens as you have them on your putting greens. Of course, mowing even during the dormant or quiescent cool season of the year is a good way to suppress many of those broadleaves. Also, using some of these broadleaf herbicides on putting greens is pretty typical this time of year. It can delay green up. We don't go into a lot of detail today about these, but these really don't have any place for control of annual bluegrass. So these on the right-hand side, they typically are not used for control of annual bluegrass. Okay, so POA, it's commonly, I got a couple of notes here. I want to try to read, make sure I understand this as I had written it previously. So commonly, it's known as annual bluegrass in North America, annual meadowgrass in much of Europe. It's colloquially known to most of us as POA. POA is actually its genus, so Poa annua is its specific epithet. Common examples of other POA species include Poa pratensis, which is Kentucky bluegrass, also known as smooth meadowgrass in much of Europe. Poa trivialis or Poa triv, which it was at one time commonly used to oversee greens of the southeast. It's now known as rough stalk bluegrass or rough meadowgrass. I periodically get samples of Poa triv sent to me, and folks say, hey, I got Poa on my greens. And usually these are courses with a history of overseeding. Poa triv can begin to look really coarse and become far more of a nuisance in, I guess, unmaintained areas. You don't typically see it in greens all that often, although it is a really good overseeding grass. It tends to wither away in our warmer, humid climate of the southeast where Bermuda grass does so well. Okay, I think I skipped the slide, so just a second. I'm backing up here. Backing up. Oh, no, there we go. Okay, so annual bluegrass, it's thought to have originated from a hybrid of two different species. Poa infirma, which we know is wheat bluegrass, and Poa supina, that's creeping meadowgrass. And that occurred 2.5 million years ago during the Ice Age periods of Europe, in Europe. Annual bluegrass is widespread around the world and has been observed on all continents, including Antarctica, though it is most prominent in temperate climates like we have in much of the southeastern United States. Annual bluegrass is an annual comprised of numerous biotypes or populations, and herein is the problem, and that is that you have populations on your golf course which may be different from my golf course, and so we have unique problems that each of us are going to face. Many of them are capable of perenniating, especially as we move further north into the temperate climates. I start to see that really in Tennessee, which is north of me in Mississippi. We see some of it in the lower Appalachian regions of northeastern Mississippi, of northern part of Alabama, on up into Appalachia. These perenniating types, they may exist in a vegetative state throughout the year. All along, they produce viable seed if they're allowed to produce seed heads. And so one thing I want to back up and say right now is this plant, as you see it right here, once it's produced seed heads, it really is no longer sending resources to these leaves. In fact, you start to see these little kind of yellow senescing leaves at the bottom of the plant. In many instances, what you find is once a plant has gone to seed like this picture, really, you don't have many herbicidal options that work all that well. If you do, they're ones that don't rely upon translocation. They're going to be very, surface applied, surface active, not systemic. Those types of products tend to kill these plants pretty easily. If you go and you try to spray this with a revolver, a monument, katana, curb, amicarbazone, which is exonerate, any of those things, you're probably not going to get complete control. So one of the kind of things that I've learned is if you can keep these plants from going to seed as long as possible, then you're more than likely going to get better control. That's not always the case, but it certainly seems anecdotally to be true. These perennial types, they're much less common than annual biotypes, and they tend to occur in frequently mown or grazed scenarios, which, hey, is turf grass. So the situations where I do see perennial biotypes are actually in a lot of these short mown areas in and around greens complexes. So that does not bode well for those of us who are golf course superintendents. Poa annua has this open triangular shaped panicle. Its spikelets are stalked and awnless. I mean, it's pretty well known, but you'd be surprised on a day-to-day basis. I get a lot of questions about what is this particular grass. The seed heads are usually the most easily identifiable characteristic, although keep in mind it does have a boat-shaped tip or a keel-shaped tip of the leaf blade. So that's another characteristic. So there are many of the most lauded golf course greens in the world that are actually annual bluegrass. I believe Pebble Beach, Oakmont, and more recently, I think Chambers Bay are all Poa annua. These are usually perennial biotypes. You get up into some of the more temperate, cooler season climates of the United States, particularly in the eastern seaboard as well as the northeast, Midwest. Yes, you do see some perennial biotypes, and particularly out on the west coast in that Pacific Northwest region where Poa annua does so well. Here's some pictures, just more identifying characteristics. Here's that pointed silvery ligule. If you really wanted to compare this to some of our other grasses, the big differences here are that Kentucky bluegrass is square, or it has a square ligule, and Poa trivialis has a very pointed ligule. But it's actually less silvery than Poa annua. So that's some characteristics that I typically look for when I'm having to key these grasses out. I'm going to drink of water here, Lisa. We got any questions?
Not at this point.
Oh, great. Okay.
Thank you.
So herbicide resistance has been really leading the discussion about Poa annua for a few years. We've kind of backed ourselves into a corner, and I think it's a wicked problem. Those wicked problems have no easy solutions, and unfortunately, we've been trying for years to solve some of these things, these problems, with chemical applications. No longer is that really viable. The extensive use of these herbicides as a primary means of control has led to almost overwhelming presence of herbicide resistance. So that includes the PS2 inhibitors, things like simazine and atrazine. We're going to talk more at length here in a few minutes about exonerate, which is amicarbazone. It too is a photosystem 2 inhibitor. So guess what? If you've got resistance to simazine and atrazine, it's very likely you have resistance to amicarbazone. Photosystem 1 electron diverters, those are things like diquat. Diquat is the only PS1 inhibitor that I'm aware of in turf. Of course, in row crops, our colleagues there have paraquat. Paraquat, because of some safety issues, can't be applied in turf scenarios for very good reason. But because of that, it's an example where we may have resistance selection pressure in row crop scenarios or in field seed production scenarios where that Poa actually gets transferred into a home lawn, golf course, so on and so forth. And so we may have a population that has never been exposed to paraquat and diquat, and then the one time you spray diquat, you've got stragglers that are not well controlled. Mitotic inhibitors, things like pendulum, pendimethalin, barricade, prodiamine, dimension, dithiopyr, pronamide, curb. All of these products, there have been cases of resistance reported to them. Glyphosate is one that the further you go north in the areas where Bermudagrass is cultured, the more and more you see it being used, all the way up into Aaron Patton's world up in Purdue. Glyphosate resistance in my neck of the woods in Mississippi really is in the northern part of the state for obvious reasons, because we have Bermudagrass dormancy, not on putting greens. So don't spray glyphosate on putting greens. The ALS inhibitors, or acetolactate synthase inhibitors, these are the sulfonylureas in many instances, things like trifloxysulfuron, 4-M-sulfuron, flazosulfuron, so that's Monument, Revolver, Katana. And then the lipid biosynthesis inhibitors, ethofumesate being the primary one that we are concerned with in turf. Now, not all of these are used in putting greens, particularly ethofumesate, glyphosate, diquat, simazine, and atrazine are not labeled. But the real issue is that if we're going to use any of the related compounds that share a site of action or mode of action, we can't use them if we've got resistance on the rest of the golf course. So that presents a problem, and we'll talk more at length in a few minutes. So I'm part of this big Resist POA project, and as part of that, we've got sites in much of the United States. The real intention is that we are surveying populations from across the states represented by these dots, or the states with dots. But we have other surveys that are being conducted. We're particularly interested in practitioners such as many of you, and getting you to respond to a survey that I'm about to present would be really helpful. So we have 5 distinct U.S. climate regions that we're sampling. We're not just sampling POA populations. We're actually also interested in the social dynamics of this weed. So that's why it's important that you would take the survey I'm going to show you in just a few minutes. So 2,000 populations, and then we subject those to a certain number of herbicides. And I'm going to talk briefly about some of that strategy of identifying herbicide-resistant populations. So we've sprayed all of these herbicides here: Roundup, Reward, Trimit, Tenacity, Progress, Princep, Monument, Curve, Finale, and we also have a non-treated. You can see 2 different populations. This population is from a golf course in the southern part of Mississippi, whom shall remain nameless, and they have curb resistance. You can actually see here curb plants that are healthier than they are in the non-treated. I don't know why. You have simazine. This is full-blown simazine resistance. This is an excellent case. But also note that Progress, Tenacity, Trimit, even Reward, these had some failure to control. I want to drive home the point that really these herbicides, Trimit, Tenacity, and Progress, are only really viable in more northern climates where maybe the growing season allows their use, as well as having competitive stands of turf growing in conjunction or competing with this Poa annua might allow them to actually achieve better control. We rely a lot more in the southeastern part of the state, or United States, on things like Princep, which is simazine, trifloxysulfuron, and all of the other ALS inhibitors, so on and so forth. Here's another case, which is right down the road for me, of monument resistance. So it's out there. It's not hard to find. I get calls daily about these issues, and we go to these courses, and we've screened so far 65 unique populations of 65 different places. Not all of them golf courses, about half of them golf courses. And then we've got another 100 to go that we're going to be screening this year and next. So these are just greenhouse screens. We've done hydroponic screening for prodiamine resistance. Prodiamine is a mitotic inhibitor. That's Barricade. But guess what? If it's resistant to prodiamine, it's most likely, or I'd say most likely, resistant to pendimethalin and dimension. And it's also going to be most likely resistant to curve as a pre, maybe as a post. We don't know. That's kind of a tricky one. But here's an instance where we're growing these plants in a floating solution, or on a floating mat in a solution that has a really low rate of prodiamine. All of these other populations, you can see they don't grow roots, and this one population happens to grow roots. So that's a resistant population that we'll take further into our screening process. So if you want to be a survey site and you live in any of those states that have that green dot in it, then please take this survey, and we'll try to get around to surveying your site. No promises. If you're outside of those states, your information is still really important. Again, as a social study, we're trying to determine how this weed is perceived, what your notions of resistance are, and we'd love to have your contact info and opportunity, if in the future, to survey your site. So you can go to this website and survey or take this survey. Keep in mind that R and that P are actually, they're actually case sensitive. So make sure you're on your game and you capitalize that R and that P. Or you can use this QR code and take this on your phone or fancy apparatus, whatever you got. Should I stay on that longer, Lisa? I'll stay on that longer for just a second.
And that will be in the handouts if they download those.
Great. Great. Okay. So some best management practices that we're going to talk more about later on, but that are often discussed out of context are these. Forgive me, I got a sinus thing here, so some of my words aren't coming out correctly, but some of these are discussed out of context. Herbicide resistance costs money, and we know that from a standpoint of if we don't have Revolver, Monument, Katana, any of those herbicides to use any longer, we're going to have to switch to something else. The problem that comes is there's really not anything else if we've exhausted the list of herbicides available to us. Aesthetics is part of this big model, this concept of costing us money. In golf courses, it's really hard to nail down how aesthetics affects bottom line. In lawn care, it's the same issue. We don't really have a way of assessing and putting a number to what the cost is. Surface quality and playability, we can quantify that. It's not altogether clear how that affects money or loses money, but it does affect surface quality. Decreased yield for turf and seed producers is an issue that is more easy to get a number for because we're affecting yield in many instances, because there's increased costs of cleaning that product, and then increased input costs for alternative means of control. And this is one that we can start to nail down how much it costs to use an alternative mode or site of action, so on and so forth. So best management practices that we're going to really go through more over the next hour or so include decreased reliance upon chemical weed control. That does mean mechanical tillage. It does mean using a pocket knife to remove problematic weeds or escaped weeds. Proper cultural practices in turf species selection. There are instances where I see golf courses installing a putting green variety or species that probably is not going to do well on their golf course, either because of their management capabilities, their budget, and or in many instances because of the climatic or environmental conditions that those golf course putting greens are in. For instance, shaded scenarios. There are places in the transition zone where we know Bermuda grass is not going to do well in shaded scenarios. And maybe bent grass is a better solution. Most often the solution is to thin or remove trees that are causing those shaded scenarios. That's a whole other story. Proper cultural practices, turf species selection, these are really important, but providing dense and competitive turf. I go to a lot of superintendents and they say, Jay, I have never and will never put a herbicide on my putting green. And if you can accomplish this goal of not having Poa annua without doing those chemical applications to your putting greens, good for you, more power to you. There are plenty of folks who can. So when herbicides are used, diversifying, rotating sites of action between years and within seasons is incredibly important. And also, we're beginning to see on the rest of the golf course and probably on some of the playing surfaces, the putting greens, emphasis on pre-emergence herbicides followed by post-emergence control strategies are going to be incredibly important. So I'll give you a few examples later on, but one is using curb as a post-emergence herbicide is where we see a lot of the instances of resistance. Using it as a pre-emergence herbicide, in many instances, those populations are not resistant to its use as a pre-emergence herbicide. So that's a strategy that we're beginning to rely more and more upon.
Do you know
yes,
why?
I don't, and I'm going to reference Patrick McCullough at UGA here in a few minutes for his work done in 2017. He reported the first instances of, or the first population of protonibide resistance. What he found was that it was resistant to post-emergence treatments, and I think he did do some hydroponic surveys and found slight resistance, although he speculated that those populations would have been controlled with pre-emergence applications. There are instances, though, where I can see post-emergence and pre-emergence failures, so go figure. We'll talk more about some of what goes into using curb later on. So I think it's incredibly important to just rehash old information about herbicide resistance. And most of us in this chat have heard much of this but need to hear it again. So effective herbicide resistance management requires a balance of chemical and non-chemical control. We know that. Best management practices, we've talked about those previously. Ultimately, the objective is of the next 15 to 20 minutes is try to explain some of the fundamentals of herbicide resistance so that we as an industry can be better at preventing and managing resistance. And then those fundamentals need to include how herbicides work as well as how they are classified according to their sites of action. You don't know how many times I talk to very well-educated, in-the-know industry supply folks who are prescribing applications on a daily basis who ask me, hey, is Monument the same? Is it the same site of action as Revolver or Katana? And we too often are having that conversation. So I'm going to go through that today and try to lay it out for you. So how herbicides work? Normally, a herbicide is deposited on a leaf, a plant surface, and it enters that plant. It can enter by root, it can enter by foliage. In many instances, it can enter by both. It can depend on environmental conditions. It can depend upon which way the wind is blowing and how much rain is occurring. Its activity, it can be contact or systemic. So we're thinking along those terms as far as systemic, meaning moving throughout the plant. It can move acropedally, which means from the leaf down to the root. It can move basipedally up through the stem tissue into the leaves. I may have that backwards, but you get the point. It can move all different directions. And that leads to a dead plant. That's the intended goal. That herbicide inside that plant most likely is affecting an enzyme. And that enzyme has a substrate that is supposed to bind to it. Not always, but most of the time. Ultimately, that binding makes some kind of change that produces a product. That product results in sugars, fats, amino acids, cofactors for important processes. You name it, it happens. Herbicides block that substrate by binding to that site. This is kind of sometimes tossed around as being a lock and key mechanism. It's not quite that elegant. In some instances, the key doesn't quite fit the lock, but in the right conditions, it fits very well, so on and so forth. This results in toxic accumulation of product. It may also result in a backup of substrate. You get my point. This is a precise physiological site or mechanism of action. Sometimes we toss around the ideas of mode of action, mechanism of action, and site of action all in the same conversation. They really are somewhat different. They mean different things to those of us who are weed scientists. They really mean things to biochemists. So we have to be really careful. For most of my presentation, unless I am misspoken, I say site of action or mechanism of action. These are commonly called sites of action in my neck of the woods. Okay, next slide here. Okay, so I think I skipped a slide. We're going to back up. Nope, next slide. So these categorizations of sites or mechanisms can be summed up in two different ways. One, we've got the Weed Science Society of America's number-based system. So you can see that number here. It's either 1 for ACCase inhibitors, things like Fusilade and Acclaim segment, 2 for ALS inhibitors, so on and so forth. Or they can be assigned or categorized based upon the Herbicide Resistance Action Committee's alphabetical system. So that's HRAC. And that is going to be an A, B, even a subscript to some of these letters can be added. So you can have a K1. So you can have potentially different binding sites for things like the inhibitors of microtubule assembly. So for instance, curb and prodiamine, or curb and barricade, are both site 3, but they have a slightly different HRAC categorization. And this is, again, biochemically speaking, they have slightly different sites of action. So there's been a huge emphasis from the industry as well as from your academic educators, those of us in industry and supply side, to make sure that those numbers are clearly displayed on product labels. If you are in the chemical industry and you're watching this, I'm going to look closely into your eyes. This is a really good best management practice. Embedding your site of action deep within your label is a very difficult way for end users to know what site of action they're actually applying. Okay, so the site of action for WSSA is often included. Monument is a good example. There's other examples as well. Classification hierarchy is really quite fun, and I'm going to try to make it even more fun than it actually is. So photosystem 2 inhibitors might include group 5 or group 7. Group 5 includes some things that we know by name, things like atrazine or Atrex, that's a triazine. Things like Syncor, which is metribuzin, a triazanone. Hey, guess what? If you've got resistance to atrazine, you most likely have resistance to metribuzin. They have very similar, if not the same, site of action. They are a little different. There's some biochemical differences, but by and large, the mode or mechanism of resistance is similar enough that you've got resistance. Also grouped in with this group 5 is simazine, is exonerate, is a number of different PS2 inhibitors. There's some other PS2 inhibitors, things like tuppersan, that's a substituted urea. It's not the same exact binding site, but yet it is a photosystem 2 inhibitor. I adapted this slide from Weed Science Society of America Herbicide Resistance Lesson Modules. I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to that group, and particularly Ramon Leone as well as David Shaw, who have helped to design much of this. Next. Okay, so there's also a HRAC classification poster online that you can download. It's a little outdated. This is modes or site of action classifications as of 2010. I'm not aware of a more up-to-date poster, but this really gives you an idea of how chemically these are similar. So you might have inhibitors of ALS, branched chain amino acid production, and then you've got all of these different herbicides that are grouped in here. And there are different families within that. So there's a lot of hierarchy that goes into classifying herbicides. I've already read this slide. I'm not going to go through it again, but again, just to reiterate, we've got resistance to any number of those WSSA sites of action in Poa annua. So these are the relevant sites of action. That's not to mention the other sites of action that never actually controlled annual bluegrass. And there were many and still remain many. How do plants become resistant? Here's some Poa annua. Those guys are going to live and go to seed. Those guys are going to not go to seed and probably die. This is really elegantly how you get an expansion of a population. So the ultimate end goal of these plants is to reproduce. And if you can cease that reproduction, either chemically, mechanically, culturally, then you have achieved something. Mechanisms of resistance. So normal enzyme function, I've already shown you this, but normally we have that herbicide binding and blocking that substrate binding site. You may have a conformational change, so that lock and key mechanism no longer works as effectively. This is an enzyme that has, again, it's got a lower binding affinity, a conformational change in that binding site, and this prevents or reduces herbicide binding. Yep, there's a fancy, yep, great animation, a little bit delayed. So non-target site absorption or translocation based is another mechanism or method of evolving resistance. So these non-target site resistance alludes to, or this non-target site resistance alludes to, guess what? It's not the enzyme, it's some other site or some other mechanism. Absorption and translocation is one of those. Plants may evolve thicker cuticle layers. They may have a composition of waxes and fats that give you resistance. So ultimately that herbicide doesn't make its way into the leaf surface or doesn't make its way inside the plant and is no longer translocated. So mechanical cleavage of the plant structure is another mechanism. I don't know how common any of these really are in Poa annua. This Resist Poa project will try to get at some of that. It's not just as simple as either site resistance and non-target site resistance. Sometimes we have metabolism-based resistance. So plants may evolve some way to decontaminate themselves or fend themselves off from foreign intruders. Increased concentrations of this metabolic protein, cytochrome P450, is one way that it can do that. So you can think about that as the ghost in Pac-Man, taking care of or sequestering or removing the herbicide, which may actually be causing concern. Plants may evolve resistance by other metabolism-based means. So plants may start to sequester the herbicide in a vacuole and render it unavailable for action. I don't think I go into great detail of, I just skipped and I didn't see the slide, but there are other mechanisms where you have increased production of the actual target site. So in glyphosate resistant weeds and row crops, there are actually repeats of the genetic material encoding for the production of the binding site. So you get increased production of that EPSP enzyme, so that you may have to apply 200, 300, 500 times the normal labeled rate of a product in order to get control. So those are other means, and it's pretty complicated in some instances, but when it comes to, when it comes down to it, life will find a way, Lisa. I think that's in Jurassic Park. So some herbicide resistance best management practices. According to the Herbicide Resistance Action Committee, integrated weed management means using multiple sites of action with overlapping spectrums of weed control. This can be in rotation, sequence, or mixture. In rotation would mean in year 1 versus year 2 for fall pre-emergence applications, I rotate my mode or site of action. In sequence means that within year 1, I have a herbicide applied as app A and then a follow-up app B. A mixture would mean they're all put into one tank and we're spraying different sites of action simultaneously. You can spray a mixture in rotation. You can spray a mixture in sequence. So you get the point that there's a lot of lingo that is pretty involved when it comes down to site of action rotation. Clean equipment after each use, quarantining suspected resistance areas. I know that these aren't altogether that practical, but when it comes down to it, if you've got a green where you have escaped Poa annua, I would sure be taking that piece of equipment back and cleaning it up before going to other greens, or I would be mowing that green last. I know that's not practical, but it's also not practical to hand pick thousands of Poa annua plants from a putting green. Use full labeled rates at proper timings. I think years ago we really found that folks were using low labeled rates of some of these ALS inhibitors. They're already so potent when they work. They're grams per acre of active ingredient, whereas when you're using them at really low rates, you tend not to get full control, and so you get escapes that tend to go to seed and propagate and form a really stable population that has resistance issues. Scouting fields after application and avoiding allowing weeds to go to seed or proliferate vegetatively, and this ultimately means scouting and eradicating escapes. And that's also not altogether practical, but there's some non-cultural means of control that we'll start to experiment with, things like phrase mowing, things like mowing practices to remove seed heads. Many of these things are going to be increasingly important with the ongoing evolution of herbicide-resistant populations of Poa annua. Again, showed this slide already. It's shown several times to reiterate just which herbicides we're dealing with resistance to. So an integrated approach is required. Appropriate grass species, variety selection for intended use, cultural practices that favor the desired grass, and then preventative control strategies, including quarantining suspected resistance areas and using clean sod and seed. Using clean sod and seed, I don't know how you find out if you got clean sod and seed other than by visiting those sites at the time of year when harvest is, well, maybe prior to harvest, when Poa annua would be present, would be when I would want to inspect the area that would be harvested for my site. So when using herbicides, again, labeled rates, appropriate timings. Let's talk about appropriate timings real quick. If you're applying herbicides to a plant that is that size, the size of your palm, and you're calling me and you've got what you're calling resistance, there's no way that many of these herbicides would have controlled that plant even if you didn't have resistance. So I think the real problem is that this presentation I'm giving today, Lisa, may actually be about 3 months late. In my neck of the woods, if you didn't apply a post-emergence herbicide back in December when we had adequate growing weather, we had really good soil temperature, and we had really young, immature Poa plants, then you missed an opportunity. So applying this time and trying to get post control is just not effective anymore. So overlapping sites of action, rotation, sequence, or mixture. I'm going to show you some examples here in a little bit of what that looks like. You run into a problem that you don't have enough herbicides to really make this viable on golf course putting greens, but you do on the other parts of your golf courses, and then scouting after application and eradicating escapes. So some overarching symptomology for, well, this example is site of action, what specific enzyme process is affected, and then I'm going to give you some example herbicides. Let me walk through this. So I'm going to show you some slides here in a minute. They're going to have overarching symptomology, so that's going to be photosystem 2 inhibition, and then you're going to have site of action, which is going to be the D1 binding protein of the photosynthetic complex, and then you're going to have some example herbicides. Walk you through some of those real quick. Amino acid inhibitors, amino acid synthesis inhibitors. So there are a lot of different amino acid synthesis inhibiting herbicides. Those groups include the branched chain amino acid inhibitors or inhibitor glyphosate, the aromatic amino acid inhibiting herbicides, that's going to be ALS inhibitors. So these amino acids, what do? Amino acids, they're organic compounds, which means they have carbon in them. They also have an amine group, and each amino acid has an R group. Those R groups are things like here in valine, you've got these 3 different carbon groups. You may have leucine or isoleucine. These are all these reactive groups that have different numbers of carbon. These amino acids, they make proteins. So if I work out in the morning, I might have chocolate milk or some kind of amino acid substitute afterwards in order to build protein back in my body. Plants do the same thing with proteins. They're responsible for a number of other physiological roles within plants: enzyme production, cell wall function, all those things. Inhibition leads to decreased production of proteins and nucleic acids. In fact, when I am dealing with herbicide symptomology in my weed science classes, or when I'm dealing with our weed science teams, we talk about plants that are slowly starving to death. And what actually this amino acid synthesis inhibition looks like is it takes forever for a plant to die. Sometimes with some of these ALS inhibitors, the sulfonylureas, trifloxy, 4-M-sulfuron, whatever, flazosulfuron, they take sometimes 3, 4, 5 weeks for that plant to grow itself to death. But ultimately, as most of us know, that means a complete kill, as long as you don't have resistance. Acetolactate synthase inhibitors, these ALS inhibitors, include the sulfonylureas, Katana, which is flazosulfuron, Revolver, 4-M-sulfuron, Monument, which is trifloxysulfuron, Certainty, which is sulfosulfuron, Negate, which is rimsulfuron plus metsulfuron, and then just the basic rimsulfuron product that is no longer available is Transit, but most of us will remember Transit back in the day. There's also the pyrimidinal thiobenzoates, which include Velocity. Velocity is not altogether that effective on golf course putting greens. It would be on cool season scenarios where we're using Velocity. I don't know how many of us are actually using Velocity that often. I'm trying to find a couple of slides here. Lisa, forgive me. Yeah, so got it. Okay, amino acid. Back up. There we go. Amino acid synthesis inhibitors also include the 5-enol pyruvyl shikimate 3-phosphate synthase inhibitors, EPSP for short. This is the only herbicide, glyphosate. So glyphosate is available as numerous different formulations. It's a key enzyme in the shikimic acid pathway, and it blocks the production of aromatic amino acids, tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. Root growth inhibitors, these are the group 3 herbicides, microtubule assembly inhibitors. They interfere with the actual reproduction, well, the separation of chromosomes within the plant. So you remember those spindle fibers are actually pulling apart the chromosome pairs. And when they're pulling apart those chromosome pairs, if they do that incorrectly, they lead to improper reproduction of a plant cell. The key here is that the root formation in these young plants, or in any plant, is the root is really the active growing point below ground. And it's growing so rapidly that if you barely interfere with cell division, you get exponentially more important or consequential consequences. So you're basically destroying that plant's ability to absorb moisture, nutrients, whatever. So those herbicides, man, Lisa, what's going on here?
I don't know. Are you clicking too fast?
I have been accused of being impatient before.
Well,
so most herbicides inhibit root growth of desired turf. This is a big old stolon of St. Augustine grass. It doesn't matter what grass it is. It just really is a good example of the kind of symptomology that we see with these herbicides. This is a root that should be really healthy, just like this one in the foreground here, and have lots of these little root hairs or secondary roots with root hairs. Those root hairs are really where you get the majority of surface area that allows you to take nutrients and water into the plant. And so even the slightest disruption can cause really pretty serious consequences, even to the desired grasses or the desired turf that you want on your putting green. Microtubule assembly inhibitors include dinitroanilins. These are prodiamine, which is barricade, pendimethalin, which is pendulum, dithiopyr, which is dimension, and then protamide, which is curb. There are some other older mitotic inhibiting herbicides, surflan, treflan, Alan, I don't know. There's so many of these yellow and orange herbicides that go years back that I'm not familiar with all of them, and most of them are not being used in turf anymore. None of these, I should say, none of these are used on golf course putting greens other than curb, which is protamide, and then also keep in mind that Dimension does not have a label on golf course putting greens, but there may be some dithiopyr products out there that I don't know about that are granular and still exist on the market. I don't quite know. Photosystem 2 inhibitors, this is group 5. The real early cases of herbicide resistance in Poa annua were reported in Mississippi. Ken Hutto, who's now at FMC, actually did a master's or Ph.D. under Yul Coates studying the populations of PS2 inhibiting herbicide resistant Poa annua across the state of Mississippi and throughout the southeast. He had greenhouses full of this stuff. And so we're actually revisiting many of those golf courses that he went to, and we're doing a follow-up study. Here we are 25 years later, trying to figure out if those populations are still resistant, which they probably are, and whether or not some of those populations he reported to be susceptible, so not resistant, have they evolved resistance? So that's really fun and a side project that we've got going on as part of this Resist Poa project. These herbicides include things like atrazine and simazine, simazine being one that is almost at this point so cheap and effective on broadleaves that it probably should be in many of our fall and spring applications, even if we have resistance in our Poa annua populations. That said, there's a lot of folks that don't have simazine resistance that just have forgotten or stopped using Princep, and I frequently tell folks they should revisit it. Now, keep in mind, if you had resistance 2, 5, 10, 15 years ago to Princep, you still have those populations on site that have the genetics for resistance to Princep. What often happens is when we go into these sites and we pick 5 or 6 plants, maybe only one of those plants will be resistant. But when we propagate that plant out or allow it to go to seed, it sure enough is resistant. So you may still have some effective use of it. It just doesn't control everything, and that calls into it calls into importance how you should be including a different site of action with that Princep application. We'll talk more at length about that in a few minutes. Metribuzin, which is Syncor, and Exonerate, which is actually labeled on golf course putting greens. They're all photosystem 2 inhibitors, and they all share a very similar binding site or site of action. So if you've got Princep resistance on the rest of your golf course, chances are also that Exonerate's not going to work altogether that well on the populations on your putting green, which means you probably need to have something else in the tank if you're going to use it. We'll talk more about that. Hold your horses. So this is what PS2 inhibiting herbicide resistance really looks like, and you can see atrazine here pretty clearly defined by this plot border. What you find is when this was applied in October, we had pretty good pre-emergence activity with many of our other herbicides, and we had some activity with atrazine. I don't think anyone would dispute that you've got less Poa populations here than you might next door in a non-treated or in this alleyway between another treatment. But in the end, you just don't get complete control. Nitrogen metabolism, this is the glutamine synthase inhibiting herbicides. These include ammonia. It includes one active ingredient, which is glyphosate, phenolic. These herbicides lead to the ineffective conversion of glutamate to ammonia. Ammonia, if any of you have ever smelled household ammonia, it is a caustic material. When it is produced and overaccumulates in the plant, it causes destruction of cells, inhibition of key light harvesting processes. Anything that can go wrong goes wrong within those plants. So the protoporphyrin oxidase inhibitors, these are protox inhibitors. We probably need to talk more at length about these in the industry as far as their place controlling Poa annua. We certainly know that flumioxazin and oxidazole have their place for control of Poa. I think all too often we're overlooking these in the rest of our golf course because of the price and because of some of the nuances of use. For instance, Ronstar causes destruction or injury to non-dormant Bermudagrass when it's applied as a liquid. When it's applied as a granule, sorry, I'm going to shut my phone off here real quick. Phone's ringing. So when it's applied as a granular material, it's usually very safe unless it is solubilized by a rain event or a heavy irrigation event, and then it often can redeposit onto leaf surfaces. So that's a cautionary tale. Also, SureGuard, flumioxazin has its place for burn down and residual control of Poa annua. The issue is how many applications of SureGuard can you make in a season? What should you be putting in the tank with it? You're making these applications at dormant times of year, and so in my area, we really are kind of short on those opportunities to apply this material on dormant Bermuda, if that makes sense. So membrane disruptors, reward, this is the only one. It diverts electrons or energy from the photosystem that is not harvesting, is not the light harvesting portion, but is the dark reaction of photosynthesis. And then it leads to these herbicide radicals, which actually go wild and lead to membrane destruction. Again, not labeled in golf course putting greens, but I'm trying to drive home what our real limitations are as far as availability on golf course putting greens. Shoot growth inhibitors, these are the very long chain fatty acid synthesis inhibitors, including dimethenamide and metolachlor, Tower and Pennant Magnum, respectively. These herbicides typically affect weeds before emergence, so they're pre-emergence active, not post-emergence active in most instances on Poa annua. So the new kid on the block is Spectacles. Spectacles been around since 2008 or 9. It is a cellulose biosynthesis inhibitor. There are other cellulose biosynthesis inhibitors, but it is a group 29. It inhibits cell wall biosynthesis. It's not really well understood, but possibly by interrupting cellulose synthesis. The site of action is, again, not well characterized. Spectacle is indaziflam. It's available as a liquid flowable material. It's also been available as a granular material. So there are some nuances to its use. One is it's not labeled on putting greens, in my opinion, nor should it be, because it does have safety issues, particularly on sandy soils, where it actually moves down through the sand and it can cause all kinds of problems with root formation. But in instances on the rest of your golf course where you may have failure of control with mitotic inhibitors, with post non-selective herbicides, it really is a good option. So is Ronstar. I mean, there's a lot of products out there that can help control resistant populations. We're going to go through some of those in a few minutes. Carotenoid biosynthesis inhibitors, I don't see altogether that much efficacy with tenacity on Poa annua other than in cool season environments. And I'll tell you, the one key example is in sod production of cool season, fine fescues, bluegrasses, tall fescue, things like that. We see sod producers using this product applied over the top of newly seeded fields. That's not really what we're talking about in golf course putting greens, particularly Bermudagrass golf course putting greens, but it does have its place in other environments. Not yet on the market, but we got our fingers crossed, is the new to us in the U.S. new product, which is PoaCure. So it's Mathias Olin, It's a tyrosine aminotransferase, which is a new site of action for golf courses, for turf production in general. And it's a key step in the production of cofactors. So cofactors are these things that are involved for other larger processes, such as plastoquinone for carotenoid biosynthesis. It's not yet registered. I think, optimistically, it could be registered as early as this fall. There's not a price point yet. I think that price point is going to be in range with what's viable on putting green surfaces. Maybe not wholesale entire complexes. I don't think so anyway. But who knows? That price could come down over the years of its introduction. It's going to be unique, and it does offer some selective grass control of things other than annual bluegrass, but I'm not sure how well I can speak to those. There's some other things out there. Lipid biosynthesis inhibitors also include the fatty acid and lipid synthesis inhibitors, benzolide, which is benzimec. It is a group 8. Its site of action is not completely well known. And then also the oxidizone, the active ingredient, ethylfumicate, the active ingredient in Prograss. So that's a group 16. Again, sites of action not well known. The only one of these that's actually labeled on golf course putting greens is benzimec, benzolide. And it is also one of the key actives in Anderson's goose and crab. Prograss, again, not for use on non-dormant Bermudagrass, also not for use on putting greens. There are growth regulators that aren't typically thought of as herbicides, but do have some herbicidal activity. Those are things like Trimit, Proxy, and Primo. These products, although they are useful for their herbicidal activity, may not necessarily be ones that we think of very often. So those are paclobutrazol, ethifon, and trinexapac-ethyl. These, if there is a conversation to be had about these, it is that they are being used on golf course putting greens, and that there certainly is reason to believe that they could play a role in helping to prevent seed production on putting greens, as well as the rest of the golf course, and then also that they may play a role in some instances to actually decreasing turfgrass competitiveness or competition with some of these weeds. So you think about Primo Max and over-application, and that leading to an open canopy, which is more susceptible to annual bluegrass invasion, seedling germination, so on and so forth. Back, here we are. Yep. Okay, so in addition to commonly, well, I don't know. Let me say this. There are a number of post applications that we think about, including all of these listed right here, for use on golf course putting greens. We don't often think about pre-emergence activity on putting greens because of the concern for turf injury. Pre-emergence treatments for putting greens are limited to basically 2 active ingredients, and they include, or they're both included in Anderson's goose and crab. Those are oxidizone, the active in Ronstar, and benzolide, which is the active in benzimec, which is one I just talked about in a couple of slides ago. Note that benzolide is benzimec. Oxidizone is Ronstar, as Ronstar G is labeled, Ronstar labeled as Ronstar G is not labeled for use on golf course putting greens, even though there is also a granular formulation, which is the goosegrass or the Anderson's goose and crab product. So I want to be clear. Ronstar G not labeled for use on putting greens. For that matter, neither is Ronstar Flow. I should also mention that dithiopyr, which I've mentioned several times previously, is available in some forms, not as any of the Dow, DuPont, Corteva products. It is a granular product. If it is available, it may have a label. I don't usually recommend it that much because turfgrass injury or concern for turf injury has mostly driven those products off the market. If you're applying Anderson's, I advise that you run an irrigation cycle immediately after its application. I also advise using it at lower than labeled recommendations. So if you look at that Anderson's label, it's going to have 1x, maybe a half X rate, and a full X rate. And I don't think you're ever going to use enough of that product to get complete pre-emergence activity on annual bluegrass. So I kind of advocate or steer people towards, if you've got to use a pre, use the low end rate of that product, spread very precisely over that area, spin the heads a couple of times to get that material water down into the canopy. Don't spin the head so much that you're actually causing there to be flooding or solution of that product that may run through confluence features or may run and concentrate on areas of the golf course, on the putting green particularly. There are products with both pre and post control of annual bluegrass. At one time, you could say curb was both true pre and true post. In 2017, Patrick McCullough at UGA reported the first case of post-curb resistance. So that's post-emergence curb did not work. Since then, we've had instances, I see 2 or 3 a year, probably many of my colleagues do as well. Maybe you have where curb just doesn't work as a post. These are mostly evidenced by failed control of tillard plants. So this time of year, if you're going out with curb, I just heard about a golf course yesterday spraying an entire golf course with curb, and they got very low activity. I suspect and have for a long time that that course has had curb resistance. That said, if curb still works, go for it. But just be aware that you need to have something else in the tank. And also, you probably need to be using those products earlier in the year. November and December are really key timings for us in the Southeast. Another option is to use it as a fall pre-applied prior to seedling germination. If you can predict when Poa annua is actually germinating, you are doing better than I am. I think more and more we're actually pushing populations to evolve later in the year as well as earlier in the spring. So the big peak flush of germination of Poa is not actually just in that September-October range. It's now being pushed into November, December, January, February. And that's a hard thing to quantify, but I think anecdotally see evidence of it. Pronomide is mainly root absorbed. The root absorption is not always the case in very young plants, particularly when you have that young cotyledon that is just emerging. You can have very good soil absorption, or excuse me, very good foliar absorption. In many instances, it is suspected that you're actually getting that young cotyledon that is germinating, that is absorbing material from the soil around it. So that green, fleshy, young primordial leaf is actually able of getting herbicide into it from the surrounding soil. Getting it watered into the soil zone of uptake is a bit tricky, because if you water curb too much in a sandy soil, you may water it right through the soil profile. Likewise, in some of your collars surrounding some of these greens, you may need to actually hand water those greens to get that stuff down into the native soils. I frequently go into golf courses where the collars are the only regions that are affected by Poa. They get really good curb control on the sandy putting green surface, but it's the area around it that's not quite as sandy where you get failure to control. There's probably some work to be done with soil surfactants in the future to try to improve efficacy of curb. Another option is to apply on a reapplication interval of about 2 to 4 weeks in the fall in combination with other herbicides. So I don't know how many of you have ever talked with Mike Goatley, but an ode to Mike Goatley is that we name things after wrestling moves or after wrestlers. So Scott McElroy has his triple threat. Triple threat is a 1/3 X rate of revolver, a 1/3 X rate of curb, and a 1/3 X rate of exonerate applied 3 times on a 3-week interval. So exonerate's not necessarily labeled on greens. It's not labeled not on greens, but you get the point. He calls that his triple threat. My wrestling move is the double tap. The double tap is a low X rate of the Anderson's goose and crab, followed by either curb plus revolver or curb plus exonerate. I'm not quite as sure whether or not you can do all 3 herbicides afterwards. We've not done that work. So those are my wrestling moves, Lisa.
At that point,
yes.
Jay, you've talked a lot about this, but I have to say the label is the law.
Correct.
We know in other webinars that we have attended, researchers can do things that are not on label. All of the things that you're talking about today, though, are more extension aimed, these are the things that you can do with those rates.
I don't think any of the folks watching this are as naive to believe that just following the label is what's going to cure this problem. That said, you got to follow the label, and I can't tell you otherwise. But when you're talking about doing these fancy tank mix combinations, we've got 3, 4, 5 different studies that show that they're safe, and then occasionally you find one that has exacerbated an existing problem, such as nematodes or shade. So again, you know, golf course putting greens are extremely tricky. I certainly do not want to be on the record, nor do I believe I have been, saying to use things off label. Always follow the label.
Right. And on that point, there is a question in the question answer box that says, can you recommend a pre and post rate for curb on ultra dwarfs?
So I'm gonna run through. I think I've got some notes here I want to make sure I get to. Curb's one of these where if you can pick a rate that is safe, you're doing better than me. The thing is there's probably a magic point, like a tipping point, where if you go above this, you're going to start to cause problems. I think that's around a pound AI. So real quick, what I want to do is in another folder, I want to pull up what rate we've actually been applying in some of our research trials. Good question. Good question. Okay, so in our research trials, the rate that we've been using we've been using the 3.3 pound per gallon. That's the Curb SC product, and we have been as high as 2.5 pints per acre. I think I probably would steer towards a pint and a half to 2 pints if I was new to using Curb, particularly if I had issues with shade, with nematodes or disease. Those things can exacerbate problems. The real key is going to be reapplication, and the reapplication interval on that is probably going to be around 3 to 4 weeks if you're looking for control. Again, if you're starting this time of year, you are months behind. Curb, if it's going to work, is going to work really well back in the fall. If you're going to try to do it now, you're going to run into some issues. Okay, so
on that point though, Jay, we have international people.
Great.
So that would be your fall season is when you're going to want to really be starting this.
That's true. And if you're in in Australia or New Zealand, then you're just going to be swapping those timings. And I understand that there's a gradient as well. Just like we have a north to south gradient, you have a south to north gradient. I'm not familiar enough with that to speak as an expert. But, you know, also is herbicide availability. Can you get hold of some of these herbicides?
Right, and that was going to be the other thing. Again, back to the label is the law. Not everything is labeled in the same way depending on where you are. So those are just some of the additional challenges that you guys face.
Yeah, again, it's the liability issue. So it's written from a standpoint of protecting someone or protecting a company. I'm trying to look at this label to make sure I give you a rate. So read the label is what I do whenever I need to know.
Read the label, Jay. What a good idea.
Yeah, I don't even see it on the label. So good luck to you. Revolver. Okay. Here we go. So here is some other things. So in 2013. Scott McElroy at Auburn reported the first cases of SU resistance. That was based upon some populations that he found in 2011 or that were reported in 2011. Prior to that time, there were some failed applications, but it was kind of chalked up to inadequate growing conditions or whatnot. These sulfonylureas, the ALS inhibitors, they're really, the resistance to them is really pretty common. The enzyme has about 6 different binding sites that if there's one change in amino acid or an amino acid substitution, then it all goes to pot and it doesn't work. I don't know if it's an exception or the rule, but it's so common in the Southeast that I no longer consider just a ALS inhibitor in the tank effective enough to have control of Poa annua, particularly on the rest of the golf course. On putting greens, again, you get into the instances of, well, is it safe to combine all this stuff? And I won't say it is or it isn't. It's worth noting that not all of these ALS inhibitors are labeled on greens. For instance, Katana, which is touted as having better efficacy during cooler weather, it's not labeled on putting greens. And I think there are instances where it actually has caused some injury on putting greens, and I think that's the reason why. Revolver, it's been tested and can be used according to the label on Champion, Miniberry, Tiff Green, 328, Tiff Sport, Tiff Dwarf, Tiff Eagle, and I'm reading that off the label right now. According to the label, also, you make applications at 14 to 21 day intervals, which is right in line with what McElroy and I have talked about with our wrestling moves. Triple threat is what Scott has done probably the most research on. It even says on the label, rotation of revolver herbicide with alternate modes of action on closely mowed but not less than 5/16 inch cutting height turf is a good resistance management practice. There you go. In my experience, you really need to use that 17.4 fluid ounce rate applied twice for effective control, and that is on susceptible populations. Again, it's an on-off type thing. If you've got resistance, you probably are going to know if that first or second application didn't work. But what people often are doing is they're coming back and they're applying Monument or Negate or Katana or any number of different ALS inhibitors, and they're saying, well, that didn't work either. Well, I can save you some money. Go back, make sure you understand which one of those are ALS inhibitors. All of those sulfonylureas are targeting the same site of action, and there's cross resistance. If you've got resistance to one, you've got resistance to all. Monument nor Negate specifies whether they are labeled on golf course putting greens, so by omission. But like Revolver, they work quite well unless you have resistance. My caution with Negate is that it has metsulfuron in it in addition to rimsulfuron, so it's probably not one I would use on a putting green. Metsulfuron can do a lot of weird things, and I steer clear of it on sensitive turf, especially putting greens. Rimsulfuron, though, which is that QualiPro product, alone, it was sold as Transit. It has a label of 1 ounce per acre on annual bluegrass that is no larger than 1 inch diameter. I don't know what 1 inch diameter means. Usually when I have a plant, it's a big clump, which is certainly exceeding that 1 inch, or it is a single tiller, a single propagule. It's also on the label, it's recommended on the label 2 ounces prior to overseeding, and that's in the southeast for folks who are overseeding with, I'm assuming, maybe ryegrass, but most likely Poa Triv. I don't know if I'd go 2 ounces, but it certainly is on the label for that special use. It might be excessive. Of the 1 ounce rate, it says on the label, repeat applications as needed on a 3-week schedule, but do not exceed a total of 4 applications. Folks, if you have made it to that third application and you have not had control, the third and the fourth is probably not going to do you much good. I think that a lot of applications, I think that's true of a lot of applications. Yeah. All of these sulfonylureas, they take 3 or 4 weeks to work. And I mentioned this earlier. I deal most often with large plants that just turn yellow and then they return and they just are not well controlled. Again, large plants have never been well controlled with ALS inhibitors, and they're not going to start now, especially if they're semi-resistant populations. One thing I also notice is that unless you're mowing the seed heads off of Poa, unless you're mowing those greens, you're probably not going to get very good control with anything you apply. And in our greenhouse trials, that certainly holds true. If we don't pull the seed heads off of those plants once a week, we just don't get as adequate of control. In general, any of these herbicides are potentially phytotoxic. So again, follow the label, but even phytotoxicity that is tolerable can cause turf stand loss, and that can even exacerbate other problems such as shade, disease, nematodes, other herbicide applications. You name it, it can cause a lot of problems. All of the post-emergence applications can be enhanced by addition of surfactant. But guess what? You're crazy if you're putting already phytotoxic material on a green and you're adding surfactant to it. So on all of the other areas of your golf course where you can tolerate injury, or you've got non-short mown grass, add a surfactant. The more the better in general. I don't need to rehash this, but again, emphasis on pre-herbicides, follow-up control to minimize escapes, proper selection for thorough control, and then understanding the inherent risk of injury on your desired turf. Those are all the fundamentals that we continue to see over and over. So things that work on the rest of your golf course, I want to talk about that for a minute before we go into a program approach on a putting green. We've got just a few minutes to do that. What's wrong with this program, Lisa? What's wrong with it?
I could
using
even
things
figure
you learned
that
in
out
math.
because the numbers are the same. And so
They're the
that
same.
means it's the same type of mode or site that's being used. And if
You are
that you're
correct.
supposed to switch them.
Yeah, you're not rotating anything. So the problem is that we've got repeat use of the same modes of action. Those are the mitotic inhibitors and the ALS inhibitors. Same site of action. Next slide. Okay, so this program rotates sites of action. I realize that this is not practical, and it may be out there, but if you could still use Princep, use it year 1, Barricade year 2, Spectacle, Ronstar. These are different sites of action. Notice that your post sites of action are also changing. You know, that might have been practical, or it might have been prescribed 10 years ago, but now chances are that Revolver doesn't work, or Princep doesn't work, or Curb doesn't work, or Atrazine doesn't work, or maybe you've got resistance to prodiamine. So we've really backed ourselves into a corner, and on the rest of the golf course, we are having to do things that are combining sites of action within year. So that might be Barricade and Monument. That's an example of a Syngenta program, followed by Princep, again, a Syngenta product. You might even do Barricade, Monument, and Simazine in the same tank load and do it twice during the year or in the fall. That's a potentially good means where you can't use non-selectives like Roundup or Finale. A Bayer example might be Spectacle followed by Revolver plus Curb. You could use Katana. You could use your favorite ALS inhibitor, whatever that may be. Again, not suitable in cool season scenarios. We've been talking about Bermudagrass today. This is Scott McElroy's data that he shared with me years ago, and props to him. He's tried this several times. This is his triple threat, and so he's got that Exonerate product. Keep in mind, Exonerate has changed formulation, so that amount may have changed. I know it's changed. I'm not going to sit here and tell you what it is because I'd have to pull up all my notes. There's your Revolver, and there's your Protamine. And what he came down to was that he was getting the best control out of products that contain Curb, but particularly when you had 2 or 3 modes of action in the same tank. You know, what are you going to do when you have PS2, ALS, and protamide resistance? I think that really is an instance that we maybe are beginning to run into. Poa Cure, Scott shared with me a good picture of Harold Walker here, who's standing in front of an ALS-resistant population where you've got Velocity, Revolver, and then you've got Poa Cure applied next to it. So I guess fingers crossed, and prepare yourselves to use Poa Cure. I'm optimistic it's going to get labeled. I don't know when that will be. Here's an example on a Bermudagrass green when ALS-resistant annual bluegrass is present, and this is an actual real-world case here in Mississippi where the superintendent on his roughs can use things like a cheap mitotic inhibitor, Pendulum, or Barricade with Roundup. He's using Spectacle in his fairways. He's got Anderson's Goose and Crab or Ronstar on tees and surrounds. And he's following up with Curb applications for post control. You know, really and truly, this guy's got Simazine resistance, so he's got Exonerate resistance. He's got Monument and Revolver resistance, so he can't use any of the ALS inhibitors on greens, Katana on the rest of the golf course. So, you know, he's down to a pretty short list of what he can use on a putting green to control annual bluegrass. So there's an example of that application. We've gone through these how many times today? I don't want to overemphasize this, but chemical weed control is really where we're coming into problems. We have resistance issues of cultural practices, and we're aware of them. We know that there are POA populations that can withstand really low mowing heights. We know that there are POA populations that are evolving to germinate at different times of year, and so in some ways they're outsmarting some of our non-cultural or our non-chemical control practices, mowing, seed removal, so on and so forth. But when it comes down to it, we are pretty limited on what we can use to chemically control these populations. Cultural practices that maintain a dense competitive turf stand are going to be ultimately responsible for whether or not you succeed or fail on putting greens. So I see superintendents who do it very well. I see superintendents who are gifted individuals but are faced with greens that are old and failing, poor drainage. I deal with superintendents who have all kinds of other issues and just can't get it together on those putting greens. Back up. Sorry, I didn't mean to click there. One more back. Okay, so this is useless. Regardless, increased reliance upon pre-emergence followed by post-emergence control. Proper timing of those post-emergence active herbicides is incredibly important. I see way more failures than not because of resistance, but because of delayed applications. Waiting until March or April to post-emergently control Poa annua just isn't going to work anymore. And then multiple active ingredients in the tank, so diversifying, rotating those sites of action is incredibly important. Props to all my colleagues again, particularly those I've mentioned by name that have shared slides with me. I don't think any of us claim to be experts on Poa control in putting greens, because as I've laid out pretty clearly today, you are really limited on things that are labeled, and then you're even more limited as far as are they resistant or susceptible populations. So that's my spiel, Lisa, and I've got time for questions.
You do, and there are several different people who have written into the question answer box that Katana is now labeled on Ultradorf Bermuda greens. So
I had no idea. PBI Gordon people, don't stop sending me trials, but also keep in mind that labels online don't get updated very quickly.
Well, and that's what I was going to say. That goes back to our discussion about the label is the law and how important it is to look at those. I've been editing a recording that was made of a seminar that took place at GIS. Nick Christians, who many of you will know, talked about some information on different turfs, and then Frank Wong spoke, and then Gary Bodansky, who's an equipment manager, talked. And the confusion of labels is one element that was discussed in this, and how, you know, you really want to check on that frequently. So that just underscores our information there. Question that we have: if Katana or Revolver were seeing resistance on Tiff Eagle, what would be a good alternative to use to help us out now?
On Tiff Eagle greens, you know, you've got your two options, which are exonerate or curb. You know, the ALS inhibitors are out, and so you're looking at maybe that 2-pint rate of curb combined with exonerate. And I don't even have my notes in front of me as far as what that rate on the new exonerate formulation is going to be. Forgive me, FMC people, but I want to make sure if I did quote that, it would be correct. So the thing is also, exonerate's labeled by omission. It doesn't say whether or not you can actually apply it to putting greens. I don't think that there, I mean, I know there are people who are doing it, so yeah.
Okay. But please type in any other questions that you have or raise your hand. You will see this webinar has been approved for education points, and I misspoke at the top of the hour. I apologize. 0.15 education points, because this is 90 minutes. So
Come on.
I know, if you enter that code 999-22-495-29686 in the affidavit, your 0.15 education points will be processed. For those who might be listening to the recording, make sure you put the date that you're listening and not the date of the original presentation. I have Tiff Eagle in Hilton Head. I've used curb the last 2 years, 10 ounces per acre in October, 10 ounces in November, and 10 in December, and had great control.
That's a really good comment that shows how to properly structure the use of curb as a pre-emerge, and instead of using it as a true post-emerge. And I'm sure you're getting some post-activity, but you're never allowing those plants to get large. You know, I think I would advocate towards moving away from just the use of curb. Curb in rotation with an ALS inhibitor, or maybe in combination, would be something to try. But if it's working for you, like we used to say, if it's working for you, keep doing it, except you're eventually going to have curb resistance. So good luck to you. I've enjoyed it, Lisa.
Thanks a lot for your time, Jay, and for putting this together. To those in attendance, remember earlier in the presentation, we saw the information about taking the survey and the QR code. You might want to consider doing that if you're having some resistant problems so that you can help provide solutions going forward.
Even if you don't have resistance problems, we really appreciate the contributions.
Speaking of contributions, I want to thank PBI Gordon for helping make this webinar available. Here is that survey info. You can, and remember that link is case sensitive if you decide to want to use that. I'm seeing no other questions, Jay. Do you have any closing remarks for us?
No, I appreciate the time, and I just want to reiterate the label's the law, and obviously labels are changing, so keeping abreast of this situation is not easy. You can follow us on our Resist POA Twitter page. It is @ResistPOA, and we'll try to keep you up to date about the ongoing research and the findings of our research.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jay. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you online again soon. Have a great day, everybody.